The room held its breath. Astra sat in the center of the space, her posture rigid, her gaze locked onto the wooden chair sitting directly across from her. It was empty. Yet, the air around the seat seemed to warp under a pressure that was not there. She did not blink. The light in the room was thin, failing to reach the corners, leaving the edges of the space in deep, bruised shadow. Every object in the room was still, frozen in a state of waiting. Astra remained motionless, her presence anchored to the floor, while the silence grew dense enough to feel against the skin. The chair was the focal point of the entire room, a magnet for her attention that refused to let go. She watched the way the light hit the wood, tracing the grain with her eyes, only the rhythmic, heavy thrum of her own pulse echoing in the confined space. She did not move. She simply watched. Astra shifted. Her right hand moved toward the table, fingers splayed against the polished wood. She began to trace the grain, her fingertips dragging in slow, deliberate circles, round and round. The wood was cool, smooth, and unyielding under her touch. She tracked the same path again, then again, a rhythmic friction that filled the silence. Her eyes remained fixed on the empty chair, but her focus fractured. The circles tightened. Her knuckles turned pale as she pressed harder, the skin stretching thin over bone. Suddenly, her hand stuttered. It jerked, losing the rhythm, then began to tremble. A sharp, jagged breath tore through the quiet, sounding harsh and ragged in the stagnant air. She pulled her hand back, curling it into a fist against her chest. The trembling traveled up her arm, a visible vibration that shook her shoulders. She exhaled again, a long, uneven sound. Astra squeezed her eyes shut, blocking out the sight of the empty chair. She needed to find the source. She reached inward, past the shallow rise of her ribs, and felt for the tether. It appeared in her mind as a silver thread, thin and frayed, stretching from the center of her chest. It did not hang loose. It pulled taut, disappearing into the deepest shadows of the room. She followed the line with her mental gaze, watching it vibrate with a dull, rhythmic ache. Every pulse of the thread sent a tremor through her torso, a persistent tugging that mimicked the beat of her own heart. She tried to pull away, but the thread resisted, anchored to the darkness by an invisible weight. It was a physical anchor, dragging her focus toward the void, keeping her trapped in the exact geometry of her own lingering attachment. The silver thread pulsed, a rhythmic throb that seemed to sync with the very walls of the room. Astra remained motionless, her eyes still tightly shut, trying to isolate the exact point where the tether anchored into the shadows. She leaned forward, her weight shifting onto the balls of her feet, caught in the gravity of the connection. Then, the floorboards behind her groaned. It was a low, dry sound, barely audible, but it cut through the silence like a blade. Astra flinched, her shoulders jumping toward her ears. She did not open her eyes immediately. She braced herself, her hands clenching into tight fists. The air in the room changed, growing denser, as if the space behind her had suddenly been occupied. She felt the subtle displacement of air. She turned her head slowly, her breath hitching in her throat. Sol stood just a few paces away. The presence of another person forced the silver thread to flicker and dim against the sudden intrusion of his calm, watchful stance. Sol did not move closer. He kept his distance, his eyes tracing the line of Astra's posture. He watched the way her hands remained curled, still holding onto the invisible tension. "Not all connections end when people leave," he said. His voice was a flat, steady anchor in the room. He took a slow step to the side, his boots making no sound on the rug, and gestured toward the empty chair. Some remain through attachment. It is a phantom weight you carry long after the person has walked away. Astra stood frozen. The words hit the space between them, heavy and undeniable. You are walking through this room, yet you are anchored to a ghost. The weight you feel is not the person. It is the habit of holding on. It is a phantom weight, Astra. It lingers because you refuse to let the space stay empty. She looked down at her own hands. The silence in the room deepened, pressing against Astra like a physical force. She stared at the empty chair, the words echoing in the hollow space of her chest. She tried to steady her breathing, but the air felt thin and difficult to pull into her lungs. Her fingers twitched against the table, tracing the wood grain in a frantic, uneven rhythm. She wanted to argue, to deny the truth of what Saul had said, but the weight he described felt suddenly, suffocatingly real. She gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white, her body rigid with the effort of holding herself together. Then, the tension snapped. Astra stood abruptly, the wooden chair legs screeching against the floorboards with a harsh, jarring sound that shattered the quiet. She did not look at Saul. She pushed past the table and began to pace the small perimeter of the room. Her steps were quick and heavy, a sharp contrast to the stillness that had defined her moments before. She circled the space, her brow furrowed, her eyes darting toward the walls. Each turn was tighter than the last, her movements jagged and uncoordinated. She was no longer sitting with the memory, she was trying to outrun it. Astra circled the room again, her boots striking the floor with rhythmic, aggressive force. She reached the corner, pivoted on her heel, and marched back toward the center. The space felt smaller with every lap, the walls closing in as she tried to reconcile the physical ache in her chest with the logic Saul had presented. She stopped dead in the center of the room, her chest heaving, her hands balled into tight fists at her sides. She turned to face him, her brow deeply furrowed, her eyes searching his face for a sign of understanding or a hidden trap. "If I let go, does that mean I do not care?" she asked, her voice sharp, cutting through the lingering echoes of her own footsteps. She took a step toward him, her gaze locked on his, desperate for a definitive answer. "Does it mean I am erasing them?" She waited, her breath hitching in her throat. The question hung in the air, raw and exposed. The question lingered, vibrating in the narrow space between them. Astra remained motionless, her hands still clenched, her eyes fixed on Saul with a desperate, unblinking intensity. She was waiting for a denial, a reassurance, or perhaps a sharp rebuke that would justify her continued hold on the past. Saul did not answer immediately. He held her gaze for a long, heavy second, then shifted his attention away from her. He moved with a slow, deliberate stride toward the window, his footsteps barely audible against the floor. Astra watched him, her body coiled, bracing for a rebuttal. He reached the heavy curtain that had kept the room in a perpetual dim twilight. With a firm, steady grip, he pulled the fabric aside. The ring slid along the rod with a harsh, metallic rasp. Immediately, a sliver of sharp white light cut across the floor, slicing through the shadows like a blade. Astra flinched as the light hit her, her hands rising instinctively to shield her eyes. She took a half step back, retreating toward the shadows, but the brightness had already claimed the center of the room. Saul did not retreat. He stood within the white sliver, his silhouette sharp against the floorboards. He watched her, his expression unyielding yet devoid of malice. "No," he said, his voice cutting through the silence with a calm, resonant weight. "You are not erasing them by letting go. You are simply choosing to stop being a vessel for what is already gone." He took a slow step toward her, his presence anchoring the shifting atmosphere. "You are carrying a ghost, Astra. You have been holding onto a version of the past that no longer exists." Astra lowered her hands, her gaze drifting back to the empty chair. The weight she had felt for so long seemed to manifest in the air. The room felt suddenly, intensely quiet, as if the very walls were waiting for her to acknowledge the truth. The silence that followed was no longer heavy with confusion. It was expectant. Astra turned away from the window, her movements slow and deliberate. She walked back toward the center of the room, the floorboards groaning slightly under her weight. She did not look at Saul. Her focus was entirely internal, tracing the path of the invisible connection that had tethered her for so long. She reached the spot where the chair sat, the wood still holding the memory of her long hours of stillness. She stopped there, but she did not sit. Instead, she shifted her stance, widening her feet until they were firmly planted against the solid ground. She pressed her heels down, feeling the resistance of the floor, the unyielding reality of the earth beneath the foundation of the house. She rolled her neck, testing the range of her motion, and felt the floor support her weight without effort. She was no longer drifting in the currents of her own memory. She was here, in the center of the room, anchored by her own resolve. She locked her knees, straightened her spine, and prepared herself. Astra drew a breath, slow and measured, pulling the air deep into her lungs until her chest expanded against the resistance of her own ribs. She held it, letting the oxygen saturate her system, feeling the pressure build behind her breastbone. With every second she maintained the hold, the tension began to migrate, coiling tightly around her collarbones and sinking into the muscles of her upper back. She gripped her own elbows, her knuckles turning white as she squeezed, forcing the internal strain to manifest in the physical contraction of her frame. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing against her skin as the weight of the memory intensified, concentrating into a singular vibrating knot of energy between her shoulders. She did not exhale. She let the pressure mount, a deliberate accumulation of force that turned her muscles into coiled springs. Her jaw tightened, her teeth pressed together, and her entire posture became a rigid, singular line of defiance against the phantom weight. The peak was here, a sharp, jagged edge of discomfort that demanded an immediate, decisive resolution. Astra closed her eyes. The room vanished, replaced by the dark, internal theater of her own mind. She did not release the tension in her shoulders. She channeled it, driving the focus inward until the world outside ceased to exist. In the center of her vision, the silver thread appeared. It was no longer a vague concept, but a tangible, glowing cord, stretching from the hollow of her chest into the deep, unreachable shadows of her past. She traced the length of it with her mind, feeling the cold, rhythmic pulse that had dictated her movements for years. She reached the point where the thread met the darkness. It was frayed. The edges were worn, thin, and unraveling, vibrating with the strain of a connection that had long since lost its angmer. She leaned into the image, magnifying the detail, until she could see every individual fiber pulling apart. The thread was thin, it was brittle, it was ready to snap. Astra kept her eyes locked on the image of the fraying silver thread. She felt the vibration of it against her own pulse, a rhythmic tugging that had governed her movements for far too long. She did not rush. She let the silence of the room deepen, grounding her feet until she felt the solid floor beneath her soles. Slowly, she began to lift her hands. The movement was deliberate, each inch of progress requiring a conscious effort against the weight of her own history. She brought her palms up, fingers extended, until they hovered in the empty space before her chest. She held them there, suspended in the cool air, feeling the tension in her forearms and the steady beat of her heart. The thread in her mind flickered, sensing the shift in her intent. Astra took a final sharp breath, drawing the energy from her core into her fingertips. With a sudden, explosive burst of speed, she swept her hands through the air in a clean, horizontal arc. The motion was sharp, precise, and absolute. Astra remained frozen in the wake of her own motion. Her hands hung at her sides, palms open, still tingling from the friction of the air. She did not move. She waited for the echo of the gesture to settle, listening to the sudden, profound quiet of the room. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her throat felt tight, unused to the weight of such finality. She swallowed hard, forcing the air into her lungs, and tried again. This time, a low rasp escaped her. It was thin, barely audible, but it was hers. She drew a deeper breath, pulling the strength from the floor up through her legs, anchoring her stance against the lingering pull of the past. She looked directly into the shadows where the thread had once vanished. "I release what is not mine to carry," she said. The words hit the walls of the room, vibrating with a clarity that had been absent until this moment. She did not stop. She pushed the air harder, her voice gaining resonance, shedding the hesitation. "And what no longer aligns with me." Astra stood motionless, waiting for the recoil of her own words. For a heartbeat, the pressure in her chest remained, a stubborn, coiled knot of tension that refused to yield. Then, the sensation began to fray. It started as a subtle loosening behind her ribs, a sudden slackening of the muscles that had been braced for impact for years. She felt the coil snap. The tightness did not just fade, it collapsed, dissolving into the space between her lungs. A sharp, icy draft seemed to rush through her, not from the window, but from within. She gasped, her chest heaving. As the constriction vanished entirely, the air she inhaled felt different, thinner, colder, and utterly clean. She braced her hands against her thighs, feeling the floor beneath her feet as the room stopped spinning. A profound, steady calm washed over her, moving from her core to her fingertips. It was a rhythmic, cooling sensation that slowed her racing pulse. Astra remained still, her eyes closed, letting the silence settle into her bones. The frantic energy that had dictated her movements for so long was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt almost foreign. She slowly lifted her hands, bringing them into her line of sight before she even opened her eyes. She let her eyelids flutter upward. She looked down at her fingers. They were perfectly still. No tremor, no involuntary twitch, no residual vibration from the struggle. She flexed her knuckles, watching the skin pull tight and then relax with effortless precision. She turned her palms over, examining the steady lines. Then, she moved her right hand toward her chest, hovering it just above the fabric over her sternum. She pressed down lightly. There was no resistance, no phantom pressure pushing back against her touch. The space beneath her palm felt hollow, but not in a way that suggested loss. She exhaled again, a long, slow breath that carried no jagged edges, and watched as her hand remained rock steady against her body. Astra lowered her hand from her chest, letting it fall naturally to her side. The silence in the room no longer felt like a vacuum pressing against her. It felt like space, vast and navigable. She took a step forward, the movement fluid and unencumbered by the phantom drag that had previously anchored her to the floor. "I feel free," she whispered. The words did not catch in her throat. They traveled out into the air, crisp and distinct. She paused, tilting her head as she listened to the lingering resonance of her own voice. She had expected a hollow sensation, a sense of loss where the attachment had once been, but that was not what she found. Instead, there was a sharp, focused clarity. It was as if a layer of frosted glass had been wiped away from her perception. She looked around the room, seeing the dust motes dancing in the dim light, the texture of the floorboards, and the sharp edges of the furniture with a new, objective precision. She was not missing a part of herself. She was simply no longer occupied by a ghost. The realization settled into her posture, straightening her spine and relaxing her jaw. Saul shifted his weight, the floorboards creaking softly beneath him as he pushed away from the doorframe. He walked toward the center of the room, his movements measured and deliberate. He stopped a few feet from Astra, his gaze fixed on her face, observing the change in her expression. "Detachment is not cold, Astra," he said, his voice low and steady, cutting through the quiet. "It is clean." He gestured toward the open space between them, his hand tracing a path through the air. Think of it as the difference between holding a bird and letting it fly. To hold it is to risk crushing it. To let it go is to allow it to be what it is. Astra listened, her eyes tracking the movement of his hand. She felt the logic of his words settle into the space where the weight had once been. She turned away from him, moving toward the window. She reached the window and pressed her palms against the cool surface, looking out at the horizon, fully present in the fading light. The sun dipped lower, a sliver of burning orange clinging to the edge of the world. Astra kept her hand pressed against the glass, feeling the warmth of the final rays before they retreated into the earth. The sky shifted from gold to a deep, bruised violet, mirroring the quiet transition within her own mind. She watched the shadows stretch across the floor, long and thin, until they merged with the deepening dark of the room. "I can love," she said, her voice steady and resonant in the cooling air, and still let go. There was no lingering ache, no pull toward the past, only the present moment, vast and still. She watched the last sliver of light vanish beneath the horizon. The room surrendered to the evening, the darkness wrapping around the furniture and the walls until every detail dissolved. Silence held the space.